Shalom, 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 everybody. How y'all doing? Welcome back to Reading with SHILO. SHILO, what's the business? Hope everybody doing good tonight. We're going to be in for a long one tonight. We in for a long one tonight. We are going to finish up. Oh, we're going to try. We're going to see if we can make it through and push through all the way. We go ahead and push through section 6. Section 6, I think it's a typo. I think it's supposed to be section 5, but it jumps from section 4 to section 6. So we're gonna go ahead and jump into section 6, which is enough for really enough for two sections for real, two big sections. So we'll try to go ahead and push through section 6. If we can, I'll just go ahead and amend the if we can't make it, I'll go ahead and amend the title and make sure that it's section 6 part 1. I didn't put it in there. Hey, shalom, spiritual conversations. Shalom, shalom. How you doing? Welcome. Come on in. Like I said, we'll go ahead and if it's too long, if it's too much for me to do to finish up the whole section, because it's a pretty lengthy one. Definitely about for sure an hour. For sure an hour read. For sure. Hour easy. Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 pages. 13 pages front and back. So to finish off the chapter. So it's going to be a pretty lengthy one tonight. Hour and a half, something like that, man. I'll try to push through. So I got my notebook ready. All right. Everything I think I need. So I hope you're in and ready for the long haul. Get your popcorn. Get your popcorn. Get your popcorn ready. So we can go ahead and knock it out. It was, some pretty good information last night on last night's read. I liked how, the time it gave me after I was done. So hopefully we'll see. I'm looking at the time at about 10 o'clock. So about 11:30, which is still good time. 11:30. I'm going to shoot for 11:30 to be done by 11:30. But without further ado, Chapter 7 of On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins, A History of African American Comedy from Slavery to Chris Rock. Chapter 7, Radio and Early Television. Section 6, like I said, which is probably a typo. It should have been section 7. It should have been section 5 and 6 with all these pages. Yeah, but let's get it. All right. Like I said, if there's anything that I need to look up, I will stop and look it up for everybody who's new coming in. For everybody that's been here, man, you know how it go. You know how it go. We're gonna keep pushing. We're gonna look up the words, see what they mean, see how to pronounce them, and keep moving on and try to finish it up. Section 6. Just when local radio stations began featuring black music and presenting scattered instances of genuine black humor, however, a much more powerful and appealing mass media began to rapid expansion. Television emerged as a viable commercial phenomenon shortly after World War II. During the ensuing decade, it would eclipse radio to become America's most popular entertainment outlet. Before we keep going, it's making me think about, I'm wondering, when was Hitler? Or what war was it when we were fighting Hitler? Because my mind goes to propaganda and the propaganda that was used. And what is television could have been the easiest medium to push any propaganda through. Because, from my point of view, that's all I see is nothing but propaganda pushed through the television. From what the shows were to what the shows are. The so-called woke, as what they call it. Those different things. It's all propaganda. Even as commercially licensed radio was introduced in 1920, crude television broadcasts had been initiated in England and the United States. But technology did not permit sufficient advances until 1930. An experimental station began broadcasting in New York City on June 30th, and a year later, one of the first scheduled television shows introduced Kate Smith singing "When the Moon Comes Over the Mountain." Thank you. So that right there, since you answered that spiritual conversation, hey, it falls in line. It falls in line with how easily it could become a phenomenon, as it said in the earlier paragraph. Television emerged as a viable commercial phenomenon shortly after World War II. With taking seeing the stuff that Hitler was able to do through propaganda, and still using some of the German officers and and stuff like that. Why not? Why not use their stuff to help control better the situation, or better the environment that they're trying to promote to go this way or that way. Blah 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 blah. By 1940, 23 stations were operating. After a lull during the war, the rapid expansion of television began in earnest. In 1946, there was only about 6,000 television sets in the country, and CBS, which consisted of one station broadcasting less than 10 hours a week, gave the airtime away free. By 1947, there were 250,000 sets, and New York City had been linked with Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia by coaxial cable. Between 1948 and 1952, network links were expanded throughout the country. Still, as late as 1949, over 40% of the nation's approximately 1 million television sets were in New York City, and another 40% were clustered in urban centers such as Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. But over 6 million sets were sold to the following year, and it was apparent that those futuristic boxes with their flickering black and white images, although still found chiefly in the living rooms of the well-to-do, would not remain playthings for the rich and urban for long. Only but one of the 10 American families had television sets at the beginning of the decade. But people gathered at the homes of friends, went to local bars, or stood outside appliances and department store windows to catch a glimpse of the boxing and wrestling matches. Excuse me. Baseball games, variety shows, and crude sitcoms that dominated early programming. In 1946 and 1947, although a few variety and comedy shows had debuted, live broadcasts of sporting events dominated network programming. But by 1948, the true beginning of television as we know it, according to William S. Paley, the networks had begun producing their own comedy, variety, and dramatic programs. Those shows were greatly influenced by the media's regional audience and the moral tenor of the times. As the television successfully expanded, it sought to attract a wider audience, and humor appealing primarily to regional interests simply did not play well. It had to appeal to rural and suburban types, the Midwest and South, as well as Eastern city dwellers. But because urban, Eastern areas were more liberal, Black entertainers fared better in some ways in the 40s during television's infancy. than they did when TV became a national phenomenon in the mid 50s. The premier Texaco Star Theater broadcast on June 8, 1948, for instance, featured Pearl Bailey and Bill Bojangles Robinson as guests on the Milton Berle showcased black performers throughout his show's peaky year. And Ed Sullivan, who had liberally featured black entertainers on his radio show, continued the practice when his Toast of the Town variety show began on CBS television in 1948. In addition to Billboard performers such as Bailey, Robinson, Eartha Kitt, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole, Louis Jordan, and Sammy Davis Jr. and Sullivan were responsible for the rare primetime appearances of black vaudeville performers like the dancer Peg Leg Bates, who Sullivan, according to Pigmeat Markham, once called the greatest Negro act of all time, and comedians such as Markham and Tim Moore in the late 40s and early 50s. Sullivan, in fact, was an outspoken advocate of black entertainers. When they were spurned by many of his colleagues, the frequent appearances of black performers on his show and his uninhibited display of friendship and admiration for the performers elicited numerous irate letters from white viewers, many of whom labeled him a nigger lover. But Sullivan never backed away from his liberal approach. His comments in a 1951 Ebony magazine article reflect his view of the role blacks played in the early television. If there has been a generosity, television has received it from the Negro. In the first place, you just can't have great programs unless you integrate the Negro performer into the show. In the second place, it has been pointed out that the Negro performer has been a great friend to television. I personally know that without his generous help, the early television days would have been a nightmare. Compared to what followed in the 50s and 60s, the late 40s were banner years for blacks on television. And in 1948, Scatman Crothers, appearing on the TV version of Showboat, a variety show that had been aired on radio since the 30s. It was the typical Stepin Fetching type role, he later recalled, with me making wise cracks to the skipper. That same year, CBS introduced the first network show starring a black performer. Although he is scarcely remembered now, Bob Howard, a pianist and vocalist whose ebullient style and spontaneity were reminiscent of Fats Waller, was one of the hosts and regular performers on the Sing It Again, a nightly 15-minute variety show, which ran until 1950s. In 1949, CBS also aired Uptown Jubilee, probably the first all-black variety show on network TV. The program was hosted by Willie Bryant, a dancer, comedian, and master of ceremonies at the Apollo Theater, where he was a perennial favorite, and features as regulars the relatively unknown Harry Belafonte and comedians Timmy Rogers and Leonard Reed, Bryant's partner in a comedy and dance team. In 1950, the jazz pianist Hazel Scott had her own show on the Dumont Network. In addition, numerous black entertainers appeared on local television shows such as Happy Pappy, WENR Chicago, a variety program billed as the first all-black television show in April of 1849. The Hobber Brooks Show, which featured blues singer Brooks and guest performances, debuted on KLAC-TV in Los Angeles in 1950 and was later seen on KGO-TV in San Francisco. And Ray Charles, at a time when he was admittedly doing Nat Cole's Charles Brown's routines, became the first black act to get its own sponsored television show in the Pacific Northwest. When he appeared with his mixed son, when he appeared with his mixed son trio, there you go, for 5 or 6 weeks on the Seattle station in 1953. The initial lack of racial controversy over those programs is in marked contrast to the ballyhoo that ensued when the Nat King Cole show appeared on NBC in 1956. At that time, Cole was a major stage and nightclub attraction. His recordings had risen to the top of the popular charts, and he had successfully hosted radio shows on 2 separate occasions. Moreover, the production costs were minimal since not only had he agreed to accept a meager sum for his own appearances, but most of his guests, major Hollywood and Broadway stars such as Sammy Davis Jr., Bing Crosby, Julius LaRosa, Peggy Lee, Harry Belafonte, and Frank Sinatra, agreed to appear for minimal union scale. Still, the show floundered and was finally canceled when it became apparent that sponsors were unwilling to be identified with a program hosted by a black star. Hazel Scott, an assertive civil rights advocate and, at one time, the wife of the flamboyant Harlem Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, became involved as a victim of the Red Scar in the 50s when her name was listed in red channels among a host of performers thought to be communist sympathizers. Her show was terminated after a season, and she moved to Europe. Scott's banishment reflected both the growing conservative sentiment in the nation and the increased difficulty that black performers would encounter in sustaining their own shows. By the mid-50s, black comedians also found the reception less hospitable. For example, Red Fox, whose reputation as a blue comedian was an added impediment, commented sarcastically about an abortive audition for the Sullivan Show. It's hard enough that trying to be funny in a bare room with just 2 guys looking at you. But even before I started, they told me to stay off the South, white women, the Congo, and the president. I asked them if I could do the Lord's Prayer. Fox's experience probably explains why top black comics who were occasionally racy, Moms Mabley or Butterbeans and Susie, for example, seldom saw the lights of TV during the period. The 50s are often remembered as the good old days, nostalgically portrayed as an innocent, contented era in which simple pleasures and high morality predominated. But beneath its serene exterior, the period was nearly as repressive and intolerant as the 20s. Both post-war periods were relatively prosperous and highly conservative. In both decades, radicalism was singularly suspect and nearly driven out of existence by red scars and witch hunts. Douglas T. Miller and Marion Nowak maintained in the 50s the way we really were. Such fears put a premium on conformity, and Bourdieu's values reasserted themselves in a manner which would have pleased the 20s fundamentalists. America had moved through the Great Depression, the New Deal, the World War II, to convene in an era of Cold War anxiety, surface uniformity, and intolerance of dissent. In the late 40s, you're right. I'm thinking about these damn 13 pages. But you're right. In the late 40s and early 50s, the Alger Hiss espionage case, the communist takeover in China, and the Soviet Union's development of the atomic bomb spurred a paranoia and xenophobia that paved the way for Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy's theatrical red hunts and helped make conformity a national obsession. Naturally, the behavior of minorities and immigrants came under close scrutiny. Although at first the violent repression that marked the 20s was absent, African Americans, who had been encouraged by their contribution to the Nazi defeat, saw their more insistent lobbying for an end to segregation and racism at home met by official stonewalling. The chorus of counsel suggested moving deliberately, a sly emphasis for staying in their place. The placid aura of contentment was little more than a rigidly maintained veneer, shielding a complex of underlying fears and injustices. The 50s may not have been, as Norman Mailer has suggested, one of the worst decades in the history of man, but the serenity of the so-called good old days was a mask concealing many entrenched inequities. By the end of the decade, these would lead to an explosion of protests centered on the treatment of blacks and women. Even earlier, beneath the homogeneous veneer, as in the 20s, there were stirrings of dissent. For instance, Beat Generation writers like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac speaked a new bohemian movement in the mid-50s with their criticism of the country's rampant materialism, sexual repression, and adherence to middle-class values. Although the era did not produce the kind of mass infatuation with Black lifestyle as had occurred during the Harlem Renaissance, there were hints of a reluctant underlying negrophilia in phenomenon as dissimilar as resurgent popularity of Black music. Freed's rock and roll, and the publication of works such as Norman Mailer's controversial 1957 essay, The White Negro. After bitterly defining much of Negro life as a kind of reactive psychopathy, a youthful Mailer mused about the emergence of a new breed, the white hipster, who rebelling against the condition of living with the threat of the instant death by atomic war or slow death by conformity, had absorbed the existential synapses of the Negro. Moreover, dissatisfied with the deliberate speed with which fundamental rights were being dispensed, blacks had begun taking matters into their own hands. In 1954, Rosa Parks' refusal to stay in her place, the back of the Montgomery, Alabama bus, precipitated the local boycott that would catapult Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence and later would be regarded as the beginning of the civil rights movement, which escalated to the incendiary black-white confrontations predicted by James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time, 1963. At the outset, however, the fledgling television industry generally ignored America's intensifying social ferment. Although landmark programs such as CBS's See It Now in 1950 and pioneer news journalists such as Edward R. Murray did address some key social issues as well as contribute to the downfall of Wisconsin's belligerent junior senator. Television executives sought to provide television executives sought to provide shows that appealed to the majority of their audiences. When affiliated stations and revenues increased in the 50s, that commercial approach led mostly to sanguine situation comedies and variety shows that reaffirmed the nation's self-righteous perception of a preposterous society that, except for the threat of communism, had only minor flaws and few serious antagonisms. And since television, like radio, was instrumental in creating a national culture and, in fact, served to reinforce the trend towards sameness, which is the propaganda, that characterized the 50s. It not only reflected but also helped create the period's prominent social attitudes about everything from family life and sex to race relations and politics. Black community leaders and the Black press, both well aware of radio's attempt to court Black audiences in the late 40s and optimistic about advances in combating negative images in motion pictures, initially perceived TV as an unsullied medium in which African Americans might be presented free of previous stereotypes. Before World War II, the Amsterdam News, for instance, had portrayed television as our new hope and anticipated the medium's more equitable treatment of Blacks, had asserted that it would be suicide to put a show like Amos and Andy on television. Later, Ebony magazine called TV an amazing new weapon that can be all powerful in blasting America's bigots. In 1950, Variety announced Negro talent coming on the TV without using stereotypes, a sure sign that television is free of racial barriers. By the end of that year, however, television settled comfortably into the familiar stereotype depictions of Blacks. The first situation comedy starring a Black performer premiered on ABC in October of 1950, with Ethel Waters taking the lead in a television version of Beulah. With first Percy Harris and then Arthur Dooley Wilson as her boyfriend, Bill Jackson and Butterfly McQueen as Oreo, Waters brought the role of Henderson's cheerful but outspoken maid to television. Beulah, like many of the early television sitcoms, defined minimally from the radio show on which it was based. If there was any change, it was in the more insistent accord seen between the Black characters and the Hendersons. All instances of real strife were exercised, and unlike the radio show, even Beulah's patented sardonic rejoinders were usually toned down. Despite Waters' spicy presence, the show depicted an ideal suburban world in which whites and Black servants lived in harmonious acceptance of the status quo. Its humor usually sprang from minor domestic disputes between the Hendersons and their children, the misdirected antics of the show's only truly comic character, Oreo, zany but cheerful, and the basic comic setup of contrasting a more perceptive, if less convention-bound, character of the lower social status with apparently more advanced characters. The program depended on comic situations and cultural assumptions common to the glut of suburban sitcoms that later dominated the airwaves, many of which spotlighted the formula interaction between a white housekeeper or maid and families who were just an exemplary, pristine, and cordial as the Hendersons. Except for Beulah's race, one might have been watching Hazel or My Three Sons. During its 3-year stint on the air, that cast changed often. Hattie McDaniel assumed the part of Beulah briefly during the 1951 to 1952 season and was succeeded by Louise Beavers. Ernest Whitman followed Dooley Wilson as Bill, and Rudy Dandridge arrived to outdo McQueen as the single-minded Oreo. Throughout the cast changes, however, little was added to that disrupted the show's determined to see no evil, hear no evil philosophy. If anything, with the switch to McDaniel and Beavers, the show became even more insistently saccharine. I think that's what it is. Saccharine. Let's see. Saccharine. Saccharine. I think I looked this up before. Let's see though. SACC. I might have looked it up before. Let's check it out. My nose is itching. Yes, I have looked it up before. Let's look it up again. Saccharine. 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 Come on, give it to me. Taking you so long. I think it's supposed to mean slow. Here we go. Sweet.
Saccharin.
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 Saccharin. Excessively sweet or sentimental. Saccharine music. Saccharin. If anything, with the switch to McDaniel and Beavers, the show became even more excessively sweet or insistently sentimental, insistently saccharine. I need to go back and finish writing down these definitions. Beavers, of course, had long since established herself as the personification of the sanguine, ever jovial housekeeper in countless Hollywood movies. But McDaniel's edgeless portrait may have astounded those familiar with her work in such films as Alice Adams and Affectionately Yours. As Donald Bogle points out, she gives a merely perfunctory performance. Let's see what that is. Perfunctory. I think it means good. It might mean a great or perfect, something close to perfect, maybe. Perfunctory. 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 PER. Perfunctory. That thing sure is listening to me because it's sure picking up the words before I type it. Perfunctory. Of an action or gesture carried out with a minimum of effort or reflection. She gives a merely minimum effort performance, merely perfunctory performance, without any of her characteristic spunk and feistiness. In one representative episode, an introverted McDaniel, after one of her customary opening homilies, don't let nobody tell you that I'm in the market for a husband. Of course, I would be, but that don't sell the market. Fuck, my bad. Don't let nobody tell you that I am in the market for a husband. Of course, I would be, but they don't sell husbands in the market. Intervenes when the Hendersons' girl shy son Donnie Hedges at the attendance of a dance. Beulah and Bill teach Donnie how to dance, and when his date backs out, arranges a blind date for him. Although through Oriole's incompetence, Donnie ends up with the girl nearly twice his age, and minor countertemps ensue. Minor contretemps. CONTRETEMPS. CONTRE. My bad. CONTRETEMPS. 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 That thing said chips. Contretemps. CONTRE.
Contretemps.
That is nothing like it's contretemps. That is not how it's spelled.
Contretemps.
I want to slap the people who wrote the English language sometimes. I really want to slap them, for real. Contretemps. Contretemps. A minor dispute or disagreement. An unfortunate or unexpected occurrence. A contretemps. Contretemps. And a unexpected, a minor unfortunate occurrence. A minor unexpected occurrence ensued. A minor contretemps ensued. For real, man, I hate when I'm like sounding out a word and then the letter, the letters all together. You know how they teach you how to sound words out in the school don't add up. Contretemps. Temp is not TEMP. It's temp. Like temperature. Contretemps, not contretemps. Ensued. By the end of the show, Bueller had set everything right. Donnie has passed his prepubescent anxiety with flying colors, and the Henderson domestic crisis is resolved. As the camera fades, Bueller, forever the pursuant of matrimony, echoes the show's continuing refrain during an interchange with Bueller. Miss Alice didn't have no cause to worry about Donnie. All she had to do was let nature take its course. Bill: I agree with you 100%, Pigeon Pie. Bueller: then why don't you let nature take its course when it comes to us, instead of swimming upstream like a salmon? Bill: that don't sound very romantic, baby. Why come you think of me as a fish? Because someday I'm gonna hook you. Bueller was so sanitized, so much a mirror image of the cosmeticized decade that today most viewers would be hard pressed to specify exactly what ignited all the fuss. Certainly, it was not due to any offensiveness in the warmed over humor. And despite Bueller's obsessive intentiveness and concern about the welfare of employees, in all depictions of ordinary black folks who maintained jobs, spoke reasonable English, and had warm, cordial relationships with one another, the show was a singular presence on early television. But Bueller, along with the host of other shows that featured black servants in more peripheral roles, became a target of the agitation to upgrade the image of the African Americans in the media. Among the other eventual casualties were Lillian Randolph, who had reprised her radio role as Birdie on The Great Gildersleeve in 1955, and Willie Best, who played traditional coon roles as an elevator boy on My Little Margie in 1952 to 1955. And Willie on The Stu Irwin Show in 1950 to 1955. Despite protests, Amanda Randolph as Louise on Make Room for My Daddy, and Rudy Dandridge as Delilah on Father of the Bride, and of course, Eddie Anderson as Rochester on The Jack Benny Show, survived until the 60s. If the host of comic servant roles on early TV emerged as a thorny issue for middle class blacks who were determined to eradicate negative images in the new medium, then the television version of Amos and Andy's show in 1951 to 1953 could only be considered a full-scale disaster. Ironically, it was also the only primetime TV program that consistently offered a realistic sampling of occasionally undiluted and authentic African American humor. As we have seen, for many blacks, Amos and Andy had been tainted by its connection with radio's racial ventriloquy. Check and double check Gosden and Carell's commercially successful blackface film adaptation had fueled the resentment. In contrast to radio performances in which their imitation of blacks sounded authentic enough to convince even some African American listeners, on screen, the body language of whites belied their slim connection to the physical style that is crucial to most genuine black comedy, and made their thinly disguised minstrel buffoonery embarrassingly obvious. Still, before wiser counsel prevailed, Gosden and Carell initially considered playing the TV roles of Amos and Andy themselves. Ultimately, that idea was dropped. And in 1948, CBS announced that a search for black performers had begun. Ignoring protests from rights groups who presented the growing black middle class, CBS promoted their search with typical showbiz fanfare. According to Ebony magazine, even President Harry S. Truman and General Dwight D. Eisenhower joined the hunt. During a White House visit, Truman reportedly suggested that Gosden try a comedian at Texas State University as Kingfish, and Eisenhower told Gosden that he had met a soldier who would be perfect for the role. True or not, the rumors and insistent publicity demonstrated that CBS and Gosden and Carell had no intention of heeding the middle-class black community's strong resistance to a visual adaptation of the popular radio show. But this was a mistake, since black rights groups led by Walter Wright and the NAACP were forming a coalition that would soon become the spearhead for a formidable social movement. Amos and Andy, a comic anachronism, as Thomas Cripps labeled the show, provided the chance for blacks to debate, both with CBS and among themselves, the precise nature of racial prejudice. Nonetheless, CBS unblinkingly proceeded with plans to bring the program to national television. Behind the scene, Gosden and Carell, as executives and writers, were joined by Charles Barton, a veteran director whose credits included the Abbott and Costello comedies, and, ironically, comedian Flournoy Miller, who, many contend, invented the prototypes of the characters, as a racial consultant and writer. Together, they assembled a cast of black actors and comedians who were featured in a premiere broadcast in June of 1951. It was, in the words of William S. Paley, an immediate hit, although 5 days after the first broadcast, the NAACP denounced the show as insulting to blacks. Still, it is fair to say that few mainstream entertainment packages have assembled a more talented group of comic performers presenting, with the limits of its medium and time, essentially unmodified black ethnic humor. Yes, there were 40 films such as Cabin in the Sky and Stormy Weather, but comedy was subordinated to music and dance in each. Later motion pictures, Matt Robbins' Amazing Grace in 1974, for example, and Eddie Murphy's Harlem Nights in 1981 would come closer, but neither would provide as vast an array of comic personalities, or in fact, any characters as memorable as the Kingfish or Sapphire. Individual comic stars would surface and shine later on such TV sitcoms as Sanford and Son in 1972 to 1977, Good Times in 1974 to 1979, or The Jeffersons in 1975 to 1985. But even the Richard Pryor Show in 1977, the legendary comedian's short-lived but blistering TV series, although funkier than much more controversial in terms of the subject satirized, would frequently abandon the insular black world where the Kingfish and Company abided. And Keenan Ivory Wayans, in A Living Color in 1989 to 1993, while it would include 90s updates of traditional African American humor couched in hip hop, homeboy paraphernalia, and would feature one of the period's most talented young comedians, Damon Wayans, drifted between ethnically inspired comedy and a satirical approach that had its roots in an anti-establishment humor of improvisational groups such as in the 60s, Second City, and TV shows Late Night Saturday Night Live. For better or worse, Amos and Andy displayed no such vacillations. It was determinedly focused on Black life and, though liberally sprinkled with familiar vaudeville bits and slapstick or sight gags that could be seen on many TV sitcoms or variety shows of the period, its humor flowed primarily from recognizable attitudes common to lower stratum blacks. It repeatedly contrasted the harebrained schemes of Kingfish and his cohorts against the day-to-day lives of the more or less sane and respectable groups of ordinary Harlem black folks. Kingfish's connivances typically involved the assistance of willing co-conspirators. Algondium. What is this word? Algondium. Algonquin. Algonquin. Well, that's a name. Shit. Algonquin J. Calhoun. I thought it was a word I had to look up. Shit. Algonquin. What was his mama thinking? Algonquin J. Calhoun, a bogus, disbarred lawyer, and Lightning, the dim-witted, docile handyman at the mystic nights of the Sea Lodge. Usually, the schemes depended on Andy Barnes' gullible nature and naivety qualities that sometimes strained the most willing imaginations. Although Flower Nora Miller and Spencer Williams, who played Andy, occasionally contributed, the scripts were written by Gosden and Carell and a team of white writers. Wisely, they left the blocking, shot selection, movement and business, and other fragments of characterizations entirely to the director and the actors on the set. This gave the splendid comic cast some scope and direct say in presenting and shaping the comedy. In addition, the veteran cast, but a crucial ingredient that had been missing in the film version of the show and unnecessary on radio, an unerring sense of physical style and timing that inevitably etched their facial caricatures in viewers' minds. Selecting the actor for the role of Kingfish was probably the key casting decision since, after the early 40s, he had become a series central comic character. And the choice of Tim Moore, even according to many who opposed the show, was perfect. Moore had established himself as one of the black circuit's top comedians by the late 40s. Further, as early as the turn of the century, when ambitious black face, much stiffer odds, he had demonstrated a flair for some of the ingenious survival tactics that the fictional Kingfish flaunted in a more larcenous vein. Born in 1888, at age 11, Moore was buck dancing on street corners for money. A year later, he had become a traveling vaudeville star with the Cora Minskit and her Gold Dust Twins, an act that toured the United States and England. During his teens and 20s, he juggled careers as a jockey and boxer with various fringe show business stints. He appeared as a geek in a carnival, pretending to bite off the head of a snake every half hour to satisfy a thirst for snake poison. Worked as a medicine show huckster, selling Dr. Mick's cure-all potion to gullible customers. We sold 2 bottles of Dr. Mick and one for us. Masqueraded as a native Hawaiian who took carloads of tourists around Ohio. Oh shit, how you pronounce this? Oahu. Oh, fuck. I don't want to mess it up. It's a Hawaiian island. Oahu, and I just don't remember how to pronounce it. Oahu. Oahu. How do I pronounce it? Oahu. Oahu pronunciation.
Oahu.
I was right. Oahu. Oahu. He masqueraded as a native Hawaiian who took carloads of tourists around Oahu, manufacturing ancient Hawaiian legends from his imagination. And during his boxing career as young Klondike, found time to work up his one-man Uncle Tom's Cabin act. By the 30s, he had worked the TOBA circuit and Broadway, earning as much as $350 a week during the Depression. In the 40s, besides performing in black stage shows, he made infrequent guest appearances on television and appeared in race movies, the last of which was Boy, What a Girl, Boy, What a Girl in 1947. When the search for Kingfish and the other Amos and Andy characters began, Moore had retired to his home in Rock Island, Illinois, and Flournoy Miller suggested him for the role. Once he had auditioned, there was little doubt that they had found the right man. During the course of the 2 years that Amos and Andy appeared on primetime television, Moore made Kingfish his signature characterization. The malapropisms that, since minstrelsy, had become a central element in black stage caricature and had received even wider exposure through Gosden and Carell's radio show, took on new comic meaning when delivered with Moore's flamboyant style. Even familiar misuses such as, excuse me for protruding, excuse me for protruding, or eyes regested, were enlived, and his solicitation flim-flam could transcend the basic inanity of lines such as, you is on your way to Rio de Janeiro. Put your John Hamhock on there. Put your John Hamhock on there. Don't hurt your sack of Cracker Jack. Or there was a proxy voting there, and you just got peroxided into the job, into moments of sheer hilarity. He was brilliantly outlandish as the conniving Pontinet of the Mystic Knights of the Sea, and amid a truly illustrious cast of comic actors and actresses, stole practically every scene in which he appeared. As Sammy Davis Jr. said, he had the unique ability in comedy to vault a lot of the buildup in the funny situation with a facial expression or a gesture that told more than 100 words in the mouth of another comedian. In addition to Moore, other regular cast members included Spencer Williams as Andy, Alvin Childress as Amos, Nick Stewart, billed as Nicodemus as Lightning, Ernestine Wade as Sapphire, Amanda Randolph as Kingfish's mother-in-law, Johnny Lee as Calhoun, and Lillian Randolph, who frequently appeared as Madame Queen. Performers such as Sam McDaniel and Rudy Dandridge were also often seen in minor parts. Each member of the cast, including Childress, who, although he played the resolutely conscientious Amos, had been auditioned for the Kingfish role, was a seasoned entertainer who had risen from the black theater circuit where some expertise was required in all facets of performing, acting, music, dance, and comedy. Nearly all had previously performed in motion pictures, radio, and television, and together these entertainers created the most eccentric, vivid, and authentic examples of African American humor that had ever been brought before an integrated mass audience. Kingfish was larger than life, more obstreperous, indefatigable, and unrepentant than any con artist, black or white, who had emerged in a radio or TV sitcom, and Moore played the role with an enthusiasm and a relish that seemed fired by the interconnection to the character. In fact, given his experiences in early 20th century America, it is likely that there was considerable considerable identification with Kingfish's exuberant rascality. If Stephen Fetch's humor mirrored the acceptable route for Negroes to finagle their way through mainstream society's racial obstacle course, one of the most condoned but by both perpetrators and victims, then Moore's portrait of Kingfish reflected a comic version of the opposite impulse, the black man as nemesis and redeemable outsider. Since Kingfish was ensconced and all black setting, Moore suffered no adulteration for the trickster role. Although comically exaggerated, he was the unmitigated flim-flam artist who was bilking strangers and friends years before the irrespectable chicanery of Sergeant Bilko came to television on the Phil Silver Show in 1955 to 1959 on CBS. We are reading On the Real Side by Mel Watkins. On the Real Side by Mel Watkins. We are in chapter 7 right now. And some of these words in here, boy, woo! The flim-flam that they got written in this book. The chicoonery. Yeah. Shit. Even trying to keep a good pace and read it slow. The flim-flam is still evident. Excuse me. All right. Shit. In different guises, this impertinent TV anti-hero would later be approximated by Sherman Hemsley as George Jefferson and Carroll O'Connor as Archie Bunker, the later a comic figure of epic proportions who would be described as a seething mass of prejudice, half-truths, and malapropism. In his family, father never knows best. Like Kingfish, Archie would be destined to weekly frustration as his outrageous schemes and wrong-headed obsessions were deflated and rendered humorous by ridicule and ironic defeat. Kingfish's behavior and practically all of his problems stemmed from only one simple trait, a loathing of manual labor. That trait was emphasized in nearly every show. In a scene from The Door-to-Door Salesman, for instance, he and Andy pause in front of his apartment to muse about what a tough day they had had. Kingfish, if it's anything I hate, It's too late down in the park when they ain't got cut grass. Kingfish responds, yeah, them long blades keep punching you in the ear and waking you up. Hey, it's a mess, all right. Now, usually, he and Andy treated the thought of work casually, since it was nearly really a serious condition. But when confronted with the threat of actual employment, Kingfish became nearly inconsolable. Sapphire, well, George, did you have any luck finding a job today? Excuse me. Yes, how can I help you, son? All right. Now, after this, what is the time for you to do? That's correct, all right? I love you. You have a good night, all right? All right. Is your brother asleep? No. All right. I'll be in there in a little while. A long while. My bad. Sapphire. Well, George, did you have any luck finding a job today? Kingfish. No, honey. It just seemed like there ain't no employment around for me. I hunted high and low, but I ain't give up. I'm gonna try again in 3 or 4 months. Sapphire. Well, George, you don't have to look no more. I got some wonderful news for you. Hey, what's that? I got a job for you at Superfine Brush Company as a door-to-door salesman. You done what? Now look at here, Sapphire. You can't do that. It's a violation of the Atlantic Charter, the Constitution, the Monroe Doctrine, and not only that, it's a violation of one of the 4 freedoms, the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech? Yeah, you don't give me a chance to say no. Kingfish's aversion to work, an attitude that he shared with Stephen Fetchin's coon figure and most often stereotypical Negro stage characters, as well as with maverick non-black characters such as Sergeant Bilko, meant that he was always strapped for funds and usually under siege from his upwardly mobile wife and mother-in-law. That, in turn, set the stage for ill-fated schemes that dominated the scripts. Nearly every week, Kingfish, cigar in hand and dressed in characteristic swallowtailed cut coat, vest, string tie, and wide-brimmed plantation hat, set out to hoodwink one of the other characters. In one of the series' funniest episodes, after being harangued by Sapphire about the worthless lot he has purchased on the upstate New York, he decides to sell the property. Naturally, Andy is chosen as the prospective buyer. And since the land once had been used as a movie set and still has the imposing facade of a suburban mansion on it, Kingfish decides to sell both the house and the lot. When Andy, aided by lightning, arrives with his belongings, there is an uproarious pantomime bit in which the two dupes struggle to reconcile their expectations of a real house with the reality of a nearly empty lot. After moving the furniture in and commenting on the good old fresh air, Andy observes that we done walked right through the house out into the yard. Retracing their steps, they return to the other side of the facade and, after moments of utter bafflement and careful consideration, conclude that, as Lightning says, this sure is a thin house. When the irate Andy confronts Kingfish about the deception, as setting that for 20 years you've been bamboozling me, but I'm telling you right now, this is your last boozle. The flamboyant con man is undaunted. He arranges to meet Andy at the property and, aided by Calhoun pumping oil through an underground hose, convinces him that although there is no house on the property, the land is oil rich. Finally, Kingfish gets his concupiscence when Andy, through his own scam, tricks Kingfish into buying the land back. The episode ends with Kingfish's greed sabotaging his own ploy, another instance of the trickster outsmarted theme. Kingfish's audacity had few limitations. And during the program 2 years run, he attempted nearly imaginable scale. As a matter of course, he kept deeds to Central Park, the Brooklyn Bridge, and the Empire State Building in the desk of his lodge office. On various occasions, he posed as a travel agent, director of an employment agency, a member of the armed forces, a doctor, a matrimonial counselor, a car salesman, all in the pursuit of quick money. In one instance, he even convinces Andy that, due to the case of mistaken identity at birth, he is actually Andrew H. Brown and that he, instead of Andy, is the recipient of a letter promising a lucrative job in South America. He is so persuasive that, as the befuddled Andy leaves the lodge office, he asks, "Hey, say, tell me something before I goes. When we was young fellas and you was taking all them good looking gals out to parties all that time, they was actually going out with a Andy Brown, huh?" "That's right," Kingfish assures him. "What kind of time was I having?" Andy asks. Without a hitch, Kingfish responds, "Those were the best years of your life." Inevitably, the schemes end disastrously, with Kingfish being discovered, or worse, becoming the victim of his own avarice. Avarice. His own avarice. Let's see what it means. Abundantly. Avarice. Is that what it means? Avarice means abundantly. Avarice. I think I'm pronouncing it right anyway. Let's see. Avarice.
Avarice.
I was correct. Avarice. Extreme good for wealth or material gain. So abundantly definitely could be in there. Avarice. His own, becoming the victim of his own, show back up, his own extreme greed for wealth, the victim of his own material gain, the victim of his own avarice. Let me write it down, my bad. Avarice. 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 As when he ends up on the freighter destined for Brazil and a non existent job, or finds himself working as a laborer in Saudi Arabia after arranging to have Andy win a pleasure cruise to the glorious beaches of gay Arabia. Throughout these episodes, Tim Moore's outrageous portrayal of Kingfish was the prime source of comedy. Bombastic, irreverent, stylized beyond belief. Moore's Kingfish was an unbridled example of the ethnic humor that blacks regularly flock to see in race films and on the stages of black theaters. It usually transcended Gosden's and Carell's original conception of the character, which, with Gosden as the voice of on radio, most often ridiculed that Kingfish jaundiced traits, his obvious improvidence, insincerity, and greed, contrasting him with the more respectable Andy and Amos. By virtue of authentic style and the exuberance with which he portrayed Kingfish, Moore projected a character whose jubilant flouting with conviction struck a resonant chord with the large section of the black underclass. Now, Moore's Kingfish was not simply the trifling, scheming parasite that he is often made out to be. For many African Americans, he mirrored an iconoclastic impulse that had lingered since slavery. In many ways, he personified the irreverent trickster who refused to be contained or thwarted by a society that merely tolerated his existence. On television, as with his real life prototypes, he almost never won his battles, but he also never succumbed. His theatrical style, irrepressible nature, and consistent twitching of the social norm made him the show's most humorous character and, in all likelihood, the most beloved by the majority of the black folks. Kingfish's antics were complemented and embellished by two other prominent comedic characters, Algonquin J. Calhoun and Lightning Calhoun. Calhoun, in fact, was crucial in creating the aura of distinct ethnicity that characterized the show. His involvement in Kingfish's schemes heightened the comedy and introduced another traditional black stage figure to television. Although he was presented as a bogus lawyer, Calhoun in fact introduced an outrageous send-up of the black preacher. His portrayal had roots in the popular minstrel slump speeches that flourished during the 19th century, but it also mirrored the hyperbolic caricature of rural Southern preachers that by the 20s and 30s had become a staple in black stage comedy and would persist through the routines of stand-up comedians to the present. Protests by clergy, I bet, and attorneys notwithstanding, John Lee's portrayal of Calhoun was always among the program's comic highlights. In one of the early episodes, for example, after discovering that Andy has an 1877 nickel worth $500, Kingfish pretends to be a doctor. I think I was about to perform a nickelotomy and slip the coin from Andy's pants pocket when Andy undresses for the medical examination, a nickelotomy. On the way to the coin collector, however, Kingfish accidentally uses the coin for a telephone call and naturally enlists Andy to help retrieve it. As they mangle the public telephone, they are discovered and arrested. The hilarious courtroom scene that follows provides the occasion for one of Calhoun's typically histrionic appearances. Calhoun: I'd like to enter a plea of not guilty for these two crooks. Judge: on what grounds? According to the report, these men were caught trying to break into a telephone coin box in the presence of a witness, who also is a police officer of the city. Calhoun: well, hey, yes, sir, your honor, but they done learned their lesson. They ain't never gonna break into nothing in front of a cop no more. Judge: this is an arrangement, not a trial. It's obvious from the evidence before me that these men should be bound over for trial. Calhoun: just 1 minute, your honor. Judge: do you have something further to say? All I'll say is, this may be only an arrangement, but I demand justice for these two innocent men. Your honor, let me tell you that you ain't gonna put these men behind bars. I happen to know that more about the law than you thinks I does. And another thing, I'm gonna see to it that you. Oh, wait a minute, counselor. Isn't your name Calhoun? That's right, your honor. Algonquin J. Calhoun. And didn't I disbar you 3 years ago? Hey, so long, boys. Excuse me, your honor, but how much ground did we lose while our lawyers was defending us? Another episode, Calhoun was called when Sapphire leaves home with her mother and Kingfish mistakenly assumes that she has been the victim of foul play. Accompanied by Lightning, Calhoun arrives at the police precinct in typical outright fashion. Calhoun: officer, do you want something? Does I want something? Young man, I come down here, I rush down here, because I wanted to know, looking at Lightning, what did we come down here for anyhow? Kingfish's wife: I was here on behalf of my client, George Stevens, and as an attorney and a taxpayer of this city, I demand action. My client feels that a dastardly deed has been perpetrated, and my client feels that his wife, one Sapphire Stevens, has been a victim of foul play, and my client demands that the police department of New York City take action immediately. Meanwhile, the officer has found Calhoun's photo on the rap sheet in their files. I demand that the foul fiend who is responsible for this heinous crime be apprehended and brought to justice without further delay. My client further demands that the resources of this entire department. Calhoun is dragged away by two officers as he continues his speech. Now, Johnny Lee was a small man whose portrayal of Calhoun was marked by a fidgety energy not unlike that of stage and screen comedian Manton Moreland, with whom Lee had frequently worked. Bespectacled, antsy, and nervous, bristling with adrenaline, Calhoun brought the electricity to his frequent appearances on the show. His rapid speech was edged with the vibrato common among black rural preachers, and his jerky, near spasmodic movements were a stark contrast to Kingfisher's protracted pronouncements, deviously studied rhythms, and uncanny projection of the conniving mind at work behind his heavily wrinkled but elastic face. Now Calhoun, a kind of mischievous sprite, as it were pup to Kingfisher's Falstaff, was an agitator or provoker as well as a baiter in the scams. Kingfish. Calhoun, I got the angle of the year. You know, Andy was a pipe welder in a factory during World War II. Now, if I could place Andy in that job, then this company would give me $200. Calhoun, oh, I see. But wait a minute, Kingfish. Wait a minute. Andy ain't gonna take no job like that neither. Out there in the desert, working in the hot sun of Arabia. Kingfish, well, Calhoun, I've been thinking about that. Now, if I can make Andy believe that this was a pleasure cruise or something, then once on that boat and I gets my dough. Calhoun, yes, sir. Just get him on that boat. Kingfish, you warped mind is warping better every day. Ha ha ha. Kingfisher's subsequent meeting with Andy, during which he convinces him that Arabia is a vacation paradise, offers an excellent example of the wily double talk for which Kingfish was famous. Andy, I done told the clerk where I was going, and he said he ain't never heard of nobody going to Arabia on vacation because it's too hot over there. Does he know what he's talking about? Kingfish, well, hey, yes and no, Andy. What you mean? Well, I'll explain that to you. At one time, Arabia was the hottest country in the world, but that's all changed now that the past few years. What you mean doesn't change? Well, Andy, they opened up the Suez Canal and let the breeze blow into Arabia. Well, how could he do that? Andy Brown, I'm surprised at you, a man of your intelligence, asking a crazy question like that. I'll explain that to you. Now, on one end of Arabia, they got that Suez Canal with the gates open. And then on the other end is the Polish corridor. Well, what about it? Well, there you is. Arabia is the only country in the world with cross ventilation. I don't guess the clerk know nothing about that. Lightning, the show's other leading comic character, was neither an articulate nor, finally, as funny as Kingfish and Calhoun. The character was essentially a thinly veiled version of the shiftless darky or ignorant Sambo type seen on stage since minstrelsy and made infamous by Stephen Fetching. Lightning, a cotton-mouthed, Quintius janitor who eclipsed the excesses of Stephen Fetching, as one critic observed, was especially odious. Portrayed by Nicodemus Stewart, or Nick Odemus, as he was billed here, the character was stripped of almost all verbal wit on the series, overshadowed by the frantic physical action that dominated the plots. There was little opportunity for Stewart to project the subtle resourcefulness that had frequently salvaged the caricature on stage and in Fetching's portrayals. Lightning was therefore reduced to a static presence, imbecilic prop, probably only recognizably funny to those viewers familiar with more textured portrayals of the type on stage and in some motion pictures. Slow moving, continually stupefied and confounded, incapable of performing any task that required thought, he served little purpose on the show beyond looking dumb. The lightning character on Amos and Andy, like many of Willie Best's role on television, gave some credence to Stephen Fetchin's complaint that the imitators were doing only the outside of his act and ignoring the soul. The instantly one-dimensional characterization of lightning would emerge as one of the principal objections of the program. There were, of course, numerous other reasons for discontent among African Americans. High on the list of complaints were the questionable characterizations of Black women and the accompanying attitudes about women expressed by the male characters. Kingfish, for instance, comically disparaged women whenever possible. What was all them old hens doing here? Oh, I like that. I like that. Let me mark that. What is all them old hens doing here? Where's it at? Shit. Fuck. I lost my place. Laughing. Slow moving, continually stupefied. There we go. What is all them old hens doing here? All right. Kingfish, for instance, comically disparaged women whenever possible. What was all them old hens doing here? He asked Sapphire in one episode. A man's house is supposed to be his castle, not a chicken coop. He regularly referred to Sapphire as the battle axe, and his combative relationship with her, a continual source of conflict and humor, prompted some of the show's most cutting remarks. On one occasion, when Sapphire disappears and Andy suggests that she may have left with another man, Kingfish quips, "Don't be silly, Andy. Anybody that would run off with her is under lock and key." When Andy considers getting married, Kingfish chides with him. "Welcome to the ranks of the living dead," then muses, "You got an eye for beauty, all right. I wish my eyesight had been that good when I got married. Then I never would have stigmatized myself into what I got." And when Kingfish hires a secretary for the lodge and Sapphire questions his motives, he consoles with her. "You know, I wouldn't look at another woman. Don't forget, honey, I've been married to you for 22 years, and you done soured me on the whole female thing." Even Andy, a confined philanderer, joined the verbal bashing when he echoed Kingfish's views with lines such as, "There ain't nothing like coming home and hearing the pitter-patter of your wife's knees on the kitchen floor." Sapphire, her mother, and the host of women that Andy courted were nearly always subjected to a kind of snickering, demeaning treatment by Kingfish, Calhoun, and Andy. They were objects of derision, as well as frequent victims of the schemes that the trio concocted. Only Amos, among the principal male characters, displayed any real concern for women or the institution of marriage. Faced with Kingfish's bumbling conveyances and anti-work ethic, the upwardly mobile Sapphire was nearly always at odds with her husband. And although the source of irritation was sometimes imagined or inspired by her fiercely homophobic mother, most often Sapphire had sound reason for nagging and reprimanding Kingfish. Sapphire, as played by Ernestine Wade, was usually an attractive and ostensibly rather prim and proper housewife, who could even be stiffly affectionate, but when provoked, she easily made the transition to dominating and irrepressibly harpy. When she did, her deafening outbursts and often violent physical onslaughts were unmatched by any marital spats that one saw on non-Black TV sitcoms. Her shoulders straightened, her hands went to her hips, her eyes flared out, And as she began shaking and bobbing her head, all hell would break loose. At minimum, Kingfish could count on the shrill, rapid fire, and unstoppable tongue lashing. In one episode, she finds out that Kingfish has hired a female secretary and responds with typical fury. You done got a secretary? Well, hey, since we got the extra, we gonna run the lodge efficient. Air Lodge got to have a secretary. Now, oh, that's different. That's a male secretary, huh? What's his name? Daphne Jackson. Oh, that is a female. George Stevens, you gonna fire her. I ain't having you working in no office with no woman. You, huh, with a secretary? And here I have to rent out our spare bedroom every chance I can get house money. George Stevens, I ain't having you work in no office with a woman. And that's final. She's got to go. Often, the hostilities did not end there. Kingfish, although bold and undaunted when it came to devising outlandish deceptions, collapsed in the face of Sapphire's physical aggression. Inevitably, he sheepishly backed off and scrambled for cover. Although often banished from the apartment, he usually managed to avoid physical punishment. But sometimes, as Sapphire's menacingly approached her cowering husband, the camera cut away. Seconds later, Kingfish would reappear, bandaged from head to foot, and an expression of mock contrition on his face. It was a ritual encounter that went far beyond the henpecked husband scenarios in other sitcoms. Disputes between Sapphire and Kingfish made the later battle of the sexes between Ralph and Alice on The Honeymooners seem child's play, despite Aubrey Meadows' unflinching resolve and Jackie Gleason's bombast. Their confrontation, nearly always ended in a rapprochement and an apology by Ralph. No tidy resolutions occurred in the Stevens household. Like everything else on Amos and Andy, these marital spats were played for broad comedy. The underlining philosophy seemed to be the more outrageous, the funnier. Now, although it was indeed funny, the show presented the skewed, unflattering portrait of Black women as tough, overbearing females who seldom displayed any hint of feminine charm. Sapphire did occasionally show a softer side, but Kingfish's schemes and integrances, let's see what it is, intransigence. It had me fumbling. Intransigence. 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 Let's see what it is. Intransigence. That is not an everyday word I use. Intransigence. 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 Intransigent. Or intransigence. Unwilling or refusing to change one's views or to agree about something. But Kingfish schemes and unwillingness to change one's views brought out the harpy in her. Kingfish's schemes and intransigence brought out the harpy in her. Her mother, played by Amanda Randolph, however, was completely one-dimensional, meddlesome, badgering, and unrelentingly critical of her son-in-law. She was the epitome of the castigating shrew. Despite the appearance of some attractive, sensible women as Andy's love interest, Most other women on the show turned out to be either simple-minded or mirror images of Sapphire and her mother. Madame Queen, played by Lillian Randolph, was an example of the latter. Still, compared to the passivity and dual predictability of the housewives who appeared on TV suburban sitcoms, Father Knows Best, The Donna Reeve Show, and Leave It to Beaver, the women of Amos and Andy offered a welcome change. They were both livelier and funnier. They had more in common with the scatterbrained humor of Lucille Ball and Joanne Davis, who, as Linda Martin and Carrie Segrave argue in Woman in Comedy, represented an improvement of sorts over the suburban types. The problem was that they were not just feisty, but outright belligerent. Moreover, since along with Beulah, Oriel, and a few other maids, they were the only Black women who regularly appeared on primetime TV. There were no other examples to counter their shrill comic images. Ultimately, despite the authentic presentation of some elements of Black humor, the usual brilliant comic acting of the main characters, and the simple fact that the program showcased an entire cast of talented Black performers, much of the Black community objected to the obvious stereotyping of Amos and Andy. In private, as in the household, the show was relished, but the comic exaggeration was a public embarrassment for many African Americans, particularly those who had struggled to position in middle-class respectability. In the 50s, a larger percentage of the Black community had begun to acquire stable, secure jobs and optimistically anticipated the fulfillment of the liberal promises of the 40s. Sensitivity was at a high point, and many objected to what could be seen as archaic reminders of downtrodden, irresponsible Black folks from another era. Amos and Andy had entered the TV stakes at the wrong time. In a sense, it was doomed before it ever began. Even the fact that the main characters were generally contrasted only with staid, well-spoken, middle-class Blacks, including children, judges, policemen, salesmen, and real lawyers who were paragons of bourgeois virtue was irrelevant. Kingfish, Calhoun, Lightning, and Sapphire were the indelible, larger-than-life characters that they obscured any impression the others may have made. This element of comic exaggeration was forgotten by many, and Amos and Andy was judged as a wholly inappropriate presentation of African Americans. In 1951, shortly after the program's debut, the NAACP launched a vigorous campaign to cancel both the TV and radio versions, claiming they were insulting to Black Americans. An article published by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People early in the 1950s, entitled Why the Amos and Andy Show Should Be Taken Off the Air, listed the following reasons. Reason number one: the show tends to strengthen the conclusion among uninformed and prejudiced people that Negroes are inferior, lazy, dumb, and dishonest. Number two, every Negro is a clown or a crook. Number three, Negro doctors are shown as quacks and thieves. And number four, Negro lawyers are shown as slippery cowards, ignorant of their profession and without ethics. Number five, Negro women are seen as cackling, screaming shrews in big mouth close-ups, using street language just short of vulgarity. Number six, all Negroes are shown as dodging work of any kind. And number seven, an entire race of 15 million Americans are being slandered each week by this one-sided caricature. Ooh, almost down. Although there was obvious disagreement with the Black community about the program's relative merits, one poll taken during its run indicated that 77% of Black New Yorkers favored the show. At the end of the 1953 season, Amos and Andy was canceled. Ironically, It was both a victory for the for those stressing the necessity of positive middle class media images for blacks and the setback in terms of the presentation of genuine black humor in mass media. More than 2 decades later, in a televised interview, Red Fox would say of the show, "It was comedy, man. It was laughs. That's what it's all about. Get some laughs, and you're not hurting anyone." Some people say, "Hey, man, they shouldn't be doing that." But if they look at their mothers and fathers around the house, sometimes they'd see the same things happening. And Jesse Jackson would contend black people had enough sense to appreciate them as funny people playing roles. Their roles were so limited that we laughed at them and laughed at their roles. But after all, in the same period where all that was on the radio and TV, out came Martin Luther King, out came Malcolm X, out came Adam Powell. There was a tradition in our community of funny people, but it did not dominate Black life to the extent that it has been projected. Even to this day, our struggle is to show the breadth and depth of the Black experience. Fox and Jackson touched on two essential points. First, that there were some actual people who are not too far removed from the caricature presented on Amos and Andy. Second, the chief objection to the program was that, except for the ubiquitous comic servants, the guest appearances by entertainers, it's represented the only depiction of blacks on television. This point outweighed the comic fidelity. Although seen in syndication until the 60s, the departure of the show left a huge vacuum in the presentation of black comedy on television that would not be filled until the late 60s. As one habitu, let's see, Habitu with a little line over the habitu. I wonder if it's close to habitual. Habitu. Habitue. I wish I knew how to do it. Habitue. Habituate. A resident of or a frequent visitor of a place. Habituate. I think I've looked it up before. As one resident of the Harlem Bar commented, or as one frequent visitor of the Harlem Bar commented, as one habituate of the Harlem Bar commented, in the 50s, you didn't see no parts of blacks on TV. Me, I used to get up and turn on the radio, listen to the SHILO. That's about the closest thing to the spade that had on the air at that time. As a reminder of the servant characters were gradually eliminated from sitcoms. Black appearances were limited basically to infrequent serious roles and guest appearances by musical performers. Perhaps frustrated by resistance to their conception of humorous blacks or tired of the controversy, television executives apparently took the path of least resistance and generally ignored Black life. After the mid-50s, African Americans made their next significant screen appearances during the 60s civil rights movements, not in sitcoms, but during sit-ins and on national news broadcasts. It was not until after the race riots in numerous major American cities that I Spy in 1965 through 1968 on NBC, the first primetime adventure series starring a Black actor, appeared in 1965. And Bill Cosby's emerged as a sort of Jackie Robinson on network TV. Other roles in dramatic series followed. By 1968, Dehan Corral was appearing in the mildly humorous Julia in the 1968 through 71 on NBC, the first sitcom to star a Black woman since Beulah. My bad. I read it wrong. Excuse me. Dehan Corral was appearing in the mildly humorous Julia in 1968 through 1971 on NBC, the first sitcom to star a black woman since Beulah. The year later, Cosby appeared in another relatively staged sitcom, The Bill Cosby Show, from 1969 to 1971 on NBC, in which he played a high school gym teacher. Cosby, who began his career as a stand-up comedian, was funny and occasionally introduced guests such as Moms Mabley, but neither his show nor Julia added much in the way of black humor. Both programs seemed determined to present one middle-class black perspectives and, compared with the intensity of racial relationships in the real world, seemed antiseptic and far-fetched. The reappearance of authentic black ethnic humor, or anything remotely resembling it on television, would not occur until 1970, when NBC introduced the Flip Wilson Show, the first successful black-hosted variety show in television history. Wilson, who had been a favorite on the so-called Chitlin circuit and at the Apollo Theater, much as the comedians on the Amos and Andy show had done, brought his personal brand of black comedy to television virtually unaltered. Unburdened by a narrowly focused situation, comedy format, he was able to avoid rigid stereotypes. Wilson moved in and out of familiar ethnic types with ease, moderating his presentation with his own radiant, upbeat personality. 2 years later, Red Fox, a more controversial black comedian, would come to television in the Sanford and Son in 1972 to 1977 on NBC, a show that was even more instantly ethnic in character. By the 70s, however, the humor presented on these shows was neither new to the mass media nor shocking to its audience. The 60s had been one of the most cataclysmic decades in American history, and one of the many changes that had occurred was the abrupt ending of the black community's silent preservance of the face of racial inequity. Accompanying that change was the surfacing of genuine black American humor. A host of new comic voices, as well as more seasoned performers, had been introduced in integrating nightclubs and as guests on television variety shows. And many of these comedians had shared their mask to present a brand of irreverent, emphatically black comedy that was new to the mainstream in America. Authentic black American humor had been unleashed on an initially unsuspecting public and, in the coming years, would assume even more importance. Now, the Flip Wilson Show and Sanford and Son were but a tip of the humorous tradition that had been developing in black movies, nightclub acts, the literature, and on stages of black theaters for decades. And that is the end of section 6 and the end of chapter 7 of On the Real Side by Mel Watkins. The History of African American Comedy from Slavery to Chris Rock. Whew. I read good for a second. I stumbled for a sec. Man. Had definitely a couple of words to look up and see. But, man, we made it. We made it through. One word at a time, one page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time until we finish the book. And we are really officially about halfway through the book right now. I'm going to call it. Yeah, we about half. That look like half. We're good. About halfway through the book. So we're moving right along. Man, I appreciate everybody that rocked with me, man. Everybody that stayed in, the ones who came in and left out still, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for the likes. Thank you for the views. That one was a long one. Ooh, damn near 2 hours. Shit. But, hey, all praises. All praises. We made it through. We made it through some tough words. Tough words for me, at least. So, with that, man, with that, we're going to come back next time. Next time, we will start the beginning of part three. Part three, the real side, invisible lives and clandestine humor. So we'll be on chapter 8, race records and black films, sounds and visions in black and blue. Look at them in there. I wonder if that's on the Amos and Andy. No, that's Butter Beans and Susie right there. Butter Beans and Susie. You know that little spill from Kingfish, man, makes me want to see if I can find that episode. You know about what all them hens doing in my kitchen. It's not supposed to be a chicken coop. I want to find it. I might have to go try to look at some of this Amos and Andy stuff. I've been saying it, but I have not. I really have not sat down and really tried to find it. I've ran across it, but I have not really tried to find it. Like talking about it for real. So when we come back for chapter 8, let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. Yeah, it's gonna be section 1 by itself. Man, we are on the downslope of this book. Damn, section 2 is long as well. Section 1 is pretty long. I feel like we might be starting to get to some of the funny stuff. Oh shit. Let me go back and see. So chapter 8 looks like it only has 2 sections. Yes, it only has 2 sections for chapter 8. Section 2 is long, pretty much long as this section that we just read tonight. So when we come back to read that one's going to be a lengthy one too, probably about the same amount of time, hour 45. We'll see. If I could do it quicker, cool. But so far, so good. We are getting to the emergence of the black comedies that I know. You know, like Harlem Nights is definitely in the top, one of my all-time favorite comedy movies. Red Fox and Sanford and Son is definitely on my list. Good Times. I definitely was a Cosby Show watcher. So these are things that definitely also can be propaganda and be used as propaganda within there to promote, like they said, for Bill Cosby, their middle class perspective. Liberal views or whatever views they may have by the writers and the actors who are allowed to ad lib and just place, certain things, there on the top of their head. They can put in there what they want to put in. And a lot of times, like they said, when back in them days, most all the shows was live. It wasn't like they do now. They filmed it and or they recorded it and then edited and got it back to you, without all the mishaps, mistakes, the fuck ups, So you had to take it, how it was. But I think, I hope we're continuing to get to some of the funny stuff in this book. I definitely had some chuckles, and I hope that it's plenty more. I hope it's plenty more in this book, because we still got a long way to go. Because I know damn sure it ain't none up in the medical apartheid book. I don't think it'll be nothing funny in that. So, but we'll keep pushing, man. Thank you everybody who rocked with me for this long one tonight. This long live. Spiritual conversationalist, man. What was the message deleted by spiritual? View deleted message. Okay, let me see what that is. Let me see. All right, they were just asking about the R. Harris was just asking about what book it was. All right. So we'll see, man. We'll see how it goes. Keep handling spiritual. If they talking crazy, bust them upside the head with that wrench. But we're gonna keep pushing, man. We're gonna keep pushing, man. We're almost to 600 subscribers. We are pushing our way up, man. Pushing our way up, growing the channel. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. Let's keep growing, man. Until next time, man. I hope that y'all can find something that y'all can learn and grow from in the reading. If it has been and it was, please leave a comment on the video of what something that you may not have known that you gathered from what was read in this section. If you have some advice on other books, that may be good books to read, please leave them in the comments as well. So maybe I can check some of those out and add them to the collection and put them on the shelf, and maybe even put them in the reading library of videos. So, but we'll see how it goes, man. We'll see how it goes. Thank y'all, everybody. Shalom. Most High Christ bless. Till next time. SHILO out.